Our next speaker is Mr. Ron Gant. And Ron likes gardening, jetpacking, and knitting. All right. So if you have any questions that pertain to any of those things, I want to make sure that you ask him because he is an SME in every one of those individual items. With that, please put your hands together and welcome the great Ron Gant.
All right, let's see, this is work. That was awesome. Did you do that like over lunch or something? Or was that like, oh, okay, that's all. That's excellent. So today I want to talk about gardening. What do you know about hibiscuses? Is that the plural for hibiscus? Is it? Is it really? Are you making that up? Okay. See, I would have believed you if you were like confident about it. It's what? So like a pack of hibiscus is a hibiscus. Okay, it's a murder of crows, a hibiscus of hibiscus. Okay, this makes sense. I got this. Cool. Let's do this. So I want to make sure I have time. Talk about drift today. You've heard about this a few times, I think, right? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this week. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So let's talk about it again then. No. So I don't know. I apologize. I didn't know other people were going to talk about it. Hopefully what I say is somewhat interesting to you, but to make it maybe a little bit more interesting, let's make it a conversation. Can we do that? Like if you have questions, you don't have to wait till the end. You can just pop your hand up and we can talk about it, or comments. You can totally disagree with anything I say. That's totally fine too. Does that sound reasonable? Because yeah, like church, you do it. Oh, yes, do lots of amens. I've never had that in a presentation I've given. That would be great. Okay, yes. If I can get like I'll preach it. Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, yes, brother. This is gonna be a fun one. But no, we gotta keep it fun because it's after lunch. Like if it's not fun, I'll be talking to myself because you'll be asleep. Or you'll all be agreeing with me because you'll be doing the nod thing, right? But no, I will probably be asleep because I actually got here at 1 a.m. today. I guess it's today. So I want to talk about drift. So I've thought a lot about organizational drift, primarily because it kind of has been a focus of my PhD research. I'm not sure if that's where I'm going to end up. Because that's how PhDs go, but also B, don't tell anybody. I'm not totally sure drift is actually a thing, but we may get to that. We may not. We'll see how the day goes. So what is drift? Okay. So that was a test. You passed. Okay, good. That was a bit unfair of me, wasn't it? All right. So well, I didn't even click the button. That just happened. Did it with your mind bullets. So I did a literature review, which is, where you go into the research and you look at what all the people are saying about drift and or about something, but in this case, drift, and tried to figure out, okay, what are the common themes? What are the things that people are saying similar things? Because here's the problem I found with drift. Drift is a term that we use a lot. Sorry, I got distracted. The squirrel thing is a legit thing. Just be glad I don't know where the laser button is on this. I think I just figured out where it is. Oh, yes. But anyways, so the problem with drift is that it's something that we typically talk about after something happens. And when we talk about it, it's usually in relation to that specific event, right? So, whichever researcher you're talking about, they'll say, oh, these things are drift because I saw it in this incident or these groups of incidents. And that is I guess makes some sense in some ways, but the problem is, I think sometimes we're using the same word and meaning something different. And so I wanted to see, could I find common consistent patterns when we talk about drift? What are we saying that is similar to kind of synthesize that? And when I did that, I came up with this definition of drift, right? So drift, and so I'm putting this up here so that when I say drift, this is what I mean. And note that this is not necessarily drift into failure. I'm not talking about failure yet. I'm just talking about drift, right, as a thing, right? So when I say drift, I mean it's the persistent adjustment of performance of a task away from formal prescription or informal norm. Right, so a couple of key things there. Persistent, number one, it's time-based. It's not something, it's not a one-time thing, right? We'll get back to that a bit more because I think that's important. It's an adjustment of performance, right? So people are adjusting what they're doing, right? Which there's a really important implication in that we'll get to. And it's adjustment away from something. That's the drift part of it. And it's away from some sort of standard, typically a formal prescription, but that's not always the case. And in fact, I'm not even sure that's the most important part. I think maybe the most important part is the informal norm, right? What's a norm? It's a guy who sits in a bar and cheers. No, what's the other norm? What's a norm? Okay, yeah, so how something normally gets done, right? So it's sort of like expectations. Like, for example, there's a norm when you come into conferences that you come in, you sit down, and you face all in the same direction, right? Even though you have round tables, you're all faced in the same direction. Nobody asked you to do that. You just kind of did it. And I have been here the whole conference. I don't remember anybody really specifically even asking you to sit down. You just did it, okay?
That's not true. Charles actually tells us the same.
Every time? I didn't hear it this time. Right, so but we have norms, and these are kind of scripts that guide us, and so I think that's important. So the typical way that we illustrate this is the old black line, blue line, right? So most of you are probably very familiar with this, right? So we have the black line, which is our work is imagined, the blue line, which is our work is done, and we typically, oh my goodness, this thing is trigger happy. We typically say that little gap right there is drift, right? And I'm going to go more in detail on this in a second, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page on what we mean when we talk about drift, right? It's that sort of gap between how work actually gets done and how it gets, how we think it should get done. Yeah, Tony. Excellent question. I chose that word simply because I didn't want to just say drift, because that makes it sound like it's in the water, and I didn't want to use some of the other terms. So I think organization, because I think you can also see things like, people talk about societal drift in the literature. It's pretty rare you see people talk about it individually, but there's a key reason I think I'm using organizational, because spoiler alert, if drift is a thing, it's a social process. Right? So it's not something that exists just in one individual, it's something that exists between individuals. And I'll explain what I mean by that later. So I'm not sold on the name, so you can convince me that it's a stupid name. Heck, I'm not even sold on the whole idea, but I think, there's a reason why I chose that. Does that make some sense? Cool. All right, so I think this is a simple conceptualization of it that most of us are familiar with. It's pretty simple though, and so maybe a bit more complex one comes from a guy named Jens Rasmussen. So how many of you have not seen this model before? Okay, wow, quite a few of you. Okay, good. So this model, I'll just briefly explain it. I'll try not to take too much time on it. This model comes from a classic paper in safety science and cognitive systems engineering from Jens Rasmussen, called Risk Management in a Dynamic Society Modeling Problem, which you should all read. There will be a test. But anyway, so this model, I'll just briefly explain it. Like I said, so we are that circle, or you could say the organization you work for is that circle in the center, and we are surrounded by boundaries, and these boundaries, when we cross them, lead to failure, right? So you can see the boundary, and by the way, I changed some of the labels to make them less academic-y, but you get the point. The boundary on the far right side is our financial boundary. We cross that, we go bankrupt, right? So you can see there's obviously pressure away from that boundary to move us away from it. The boundary on the bottom is our effort or workload boundary, right? And nobody wants to work harder than they have to. One of the biggest lies the devil told us is that hard work is its own reward. That's actually a true statement if you think about it. But so there's always pressure to move away from that, right? Nobody wants to work harder than they have to. We want to work hard enough to achieve our goals and no harder, right? And then on the far left side, we have our safety or reliability boundary, our functional boundary, right? Beyond that, we fail. Now, the challenge with these boundaries is that we're not always clear where they are. Sometimes we are, particularly with like the financial boundary. It's easy to know when you don't have any money because you don't have any money. But the other ones are a little bit more squishy. The other problem is they move, right? The boundaries are moving, right? So even though this model shows them in one place, they are going to be moving if you think of a real organization. Right? And so on the safety side, one of the things we do to deal with the fact that the safety boundary or the reliability boundary is actually unclear most of the time is we create that dotted line. That's our compliance boundary. And the easiest way to illustrate that is we hopefully wear our seatbelts when we are in vehicles, and we do that thousands of times needlessly. And you don't need to wear your seatbelt most of the time because A, you're not in horrible accidents that involve needing a seatbelt most of the time. If you are, maybe don't drive. That's my tip. Okay. And B, we don't get pulled over most of the time, right? That's just not a thing. And so we don't need to wear a seatbelt most of the time. The problem though is we don't know when we're going to need it until you need it, right? And so what do? We create a separate rule that ideally is away from the boundary that says you always wear the seatbelt, right? So that's the idea, okay? So the idea of this model is we are constantly moving back and forth to trying to find the optimal position to operate in, right? We move closer to one boundary and then maybe we get, slapped on the wrist because we got too close to compliance. So we bounce back a little bit, okay? But pressures are moving, they're ebbing, they're flowing. And so we move a little bit closer again. And what happens? Maybe nothing, right? But that's not entirely accurate. It's not nothing. We actually got no bad outcomes, and we're further away from the financial boundary. We're further away from the effort boundary. So we got good things. So what did we learn? That's a good thing to do. So we do it again, right? And then maybe we step a little bit too far, and that's when the bad thing happens. That's the idea of drift. So that when people talk about drift into failure, that's kind of the concept, the conceptualization they're talking about. Does that make sense so far? You with me? You tracking? Cool. All right. So that's what I'm talking about, Jen. Amen. Hey. Okay. So some quick examples. I won't go into these in detail because there's a lot of really good literature on them, and you should definitely do your own homework on this. So some examples of where researchers have sort of pointed at drift or things that are similar to drift in my mind. I'll mention one is, what's that picture of? Challenger, right? NASA Challenger. What happened? It went kablooey. Yes, exactly. Okay, O-rings, I heard, right? So we had O-rings that solidified in the joint of the solid rocket booster. So hot gas got inside, contacted the fuel, and it went kablooey, killing all the astronauts. Kablooey. So obviously that's the technical cause. The deeper causes in the organization, if we're going to use those terms, are traced by a number of different researchers, a number of different investigators. Probably, one of the most thorough ones that I'm aware of is Diane Vaughn's work, where she came up with the term that some of you are familiar with, normalization of deviance. It's another term that I'm pretty sure we misuse most of the time, because her work actually showed that the deviance she's talking about had nothing to do with rule violations. She actually would argue that there were no rule violations in this event. She argues that it is actually deviation from what we expected, right? Deviation from the amount of risk we thought we were wanting to take, right? And over time, they, through progressive successful shuttle launches, accepted a little bit more using very standard and arguably robust risk management processes, and yet they blew up the shuttle, the kablooey. And anyone know what this is a picture of? This one's probably harder. This is the aftermath of a fratricide incident, a friendly fire incident in over northern Iraq in the mid-90s, where is this Snook? Yeah, Scott Snook studied this event. It was where two F-15s, US fighter jets, shot down two US Black Hawk helicopters full of personnel over northern Iraq. Again, very complex incident, and we're not going to be able to even touch on the details, but one of the things that Snook talked about is that the events that kind of contributed to this event on the day of didn't just appear out of nowhere. They have their, their seeds deeper and deeper into the organizational history of that task force. And even in some ways going beyond that. And so he sort of traces some of these factors that led up to this event, showing how the decisions and actions of people involved, the F-15 pilots, the Black Hawk pilots, and then also there was an AWACS aircraft, which is a radar aircraft in the area as well. How all those decisions and actions made sense because of that history. And he called these actions practical actions because they have a logic to them. And over time, these practical actions, these sort of adaptations, if you will, led up to something that he called practical drift. So that may be another term that you hear about. So he came up with a theory of practical drift that he said explains this event. This is one, oh my goodness, this is very trigger happy. This is one that I think people are probably less familiar, you know who Goldman Sachs is, but this event, so there was a banker at Goldman Sachs named Scott Mandis who left in the early 2000s to become a sociologist, and he did his PhD research on some of the ethical failures in Goldman Sachs leading up to the financial and during the financial crisis in the mid 2000s. It's a very interesting book. It's called What Happened at Goldman Sachs, and he uses organizational drift, including citing Sidney Dekker and similar folks who we're familiar with, to show how the ethical failures didn't pop out of nowhere. They were rooted in the history of the organization. And so all of these events are examples of where we, just this common theme that I'm sure most of us are familiar with in this room. So I'm not going to beat that horse to death as much anymore. These failures, these catastrophic events are not a product of just bad people. They have their seeds deeper into organizational life, right? A term that Diane Vaughn uses in her book that I like a lot is the banality of accidents, right? They're boring, right? These accidents have boring causes. They're founded in the organizational boring life, right? So that's drift. That's what I'm talking about. So y'all still with me? Yes, sir. Yes.
What do you call if it's the actual whole procedure that drifts? So, like Alaskan Airlines 261.
Yep.
It was actually the changing the whole maintenance system around that screw lubrication that ended up. And that's used to be an example of drift. And that's not a drift away from the whole procedure. That's the whole procedure.
Yep.
Yeah, if you would, for the Zoom attendees, if you would repeat every question.
Okay, so for the Zoom attendees, one attendee who's just incredibly unintelligent asked a stupid question. No, asked an excellent question where he, it's Dave Proven. So sorry for the Zoom attendees. He asked a question about, there are some events that have been identified in the literature where it's not a deviation from formal prescription. It's actually other things. So one example that's in the beginning of Sydney's book, Alaskan air crash, and I can't remember the flight number, 261, where the actual change didn't come from violations. It came from actual changing in the regulatory structure. And I would say that's more of a norm change, right? So the regulations were changing as our beliefs about what is and what is not safe shifted over time. Right. So that's where I would put that in. And I think that's why that informal norm part is really, really important. So cool. All right. So I want to dig in this a little bit more because I think everything I've said so far is like, okay, cool. So what, Ron? Does anyone know what this is? It's an S curve. Yes. It's a learning curve. This is a learning curve, right? So learning curve in organizational learning research, there's a whole body of research on organizational learning, and I'm not totally sure we've tapped into that research yet as much as we probably should have. But they have identified learning curves in organizations, and often when they plot them, you see something like this. And the idea is that initially you start doing something, you're not very good at it, but over time your performance gets better, and the amount of time you spend for increased performance it goes up exponentially, but then you sort of plateau, right? What is that upward shift? What is that made of? Adjustments, right? It's made of adjustments. It's made of people figuring things out over time, right? That's what that's made of. And I think that's interesting because I wonder if we can change that y-axis and say, okay, is that increase in performance over time or increase in risk over time? And then leads me to the next question. How would you be able to differentiate between drift and learning? And I think that is a really fundamental question we need to ask here, because one of the things that really bothers me about how we talk about drift is it's similar to how we talked about accidents not that long ago. They're always talking about the causes after the fact and then building up structures to deal with those causes, but never going back and looking at what's happening the rest of the time, because most of the time nothing horrible is happening. Does drift only happen right before an accident? No, by definition, it can't. It has to happen but well before the accident. So what's happening there? And is it only present when we have accidents? What is drift exactly? What makes it up? What's going on there? These are questions I think we need to dive into. So to do that, I want to look at this. So I know most of you are not going to be able to see the bottom of the screen, but the bottom of the screen is the most important part of this. So this is a backup camera, and I'm a nerd, and I overthink things. No, it's not. This was my parents' backup camera. That's why I took the picture of it. Okay. So they were backing up, and I looked, and I saw that phrase at the bottom, check surroundings for safety. And I thought, first of all, that's the funniest thing I've ever heard in my life. Okay. What does that even mean? Right? Like, is safety like hiding in the bushes somewhere and I need to be aware of it? Like, oh my God. Okay. But all joking aside, what do they mean by that? What does that mean? Yeah, look around for stuff so you don't hit it, right? Which, okay, that makes sense, right? And it's really the whoever the designers were, it's their way of reminding us that, hey, this is a backup camera. It's nice, it's good, but there's probably other stuff around you. Don't over rely on the backup camera. Right? And we can have all kinds of arguments about how to deal with, reliance on technology and things like that. But I think just let's focus on that real quick. Notice one thing really quickly. Notice how they can just say this phrase, check surroundings for safety. And in their defense, they had to keep it short because there's only so much space, right? But they can just say something like that and assume we know what they mean, and they're right. Right? That's so weird. Like, think about that. They can say a phrase that can have multiple meanings, all kinds of goofy meanings, right? Funny or serious, the whole range. And they can put it in context and assume we'll know what their intention was, and they're going to be right most of the time. That's fascinating. How can they do that? Are they wizards? What are they relying on? Norms. They're relying on our beliefs and expectations about what language means in context, right? That's what they're relying on, and they're using actually a pretty good assumption because most of us got it right. But to me, this sort of speaks to one of the fundamental challenges humans have just operating in the world, and then you add in the world of work and it gets a little more complex. And ambiguity. All right, so the problem we have is we're all living right now, okay? But we're surrounded by ambiguity and uncertainty, right? We just are. That's just life, right? And it's just so, it's like air. We don't even notice it, right? It is the water and we are the fish, right? The ambiguity and the uncertainty is just, it's just there. And we just have adapted to deal with it so much that we don't even recognize we're doing it anymore. But we're doing it in a non-stable way. And that's really important. Because when I read that sign, what's something that I would do as a result? Look around. That was not a hard question, people. Come on. I know. The lunch is hitting hard. Okay. Yeah, we look around. We look around to see what's going on around us, right? That's the kind of the point of this thing. Okay. But what do we often see? the same stuff we see most of the time, right? And humans are, because we're used to dealing with uncertainty and ambiguity, we are learning creatures. Learning is not something that just happens when we say it happens. It's constantly happening. We are either reinforcing our pre-existing beliefs or creating new ones all the time. Always. That's the human experience, unless you're asleep, in which case maybe there's still, I don't know, maybe a sleep researcher can tell me it's still happening. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. All right, so we're going to look around and we're going to see, okay, there's not much going on around me, and I have this fancy technology that will help me know if something's going on around me. Have any of you in recent years purchased one of these fancy cars with these backup cameras, and then you got into a rental car that didn't have a backup camera, and you started pulling back without just assuming that the camera would tell you what's going on? Yeah, right. Okay. What's going on there? Adjustment. You're adjusting your performance to optimize, to minimize the amount of resources you spend, right? Maximize your ability to do other things. That's just life. That's good, right? It's good. It's a good thing until it's not. Is that drift? Sure, yeah. Now, we're going to put it in this context and say that's a bad thing. But how is that different than a learning curve? How is that different than, you start a new organization and you go in there with expectations about how you're supposed to operate, how you're supposed to behave, what are the norms that are expected of you, but you're not totally sure. So you're going to start off slow, figuring things out, but over time, you're going to start to figure out, oh, okay, if I need something, I talk to Beth, or, the person to go to, if you got questions about procurements, Jen, you're going to start to figure these things out, and your performance is going to get way better, and you're going to become a more effective employee. But because that's not in the context of what we're talking about, we don't call that drift for some reason, even though the underlying processes that are creating those behaviors are exactly the same. There is no difference that I'm aware of. The adjustments that allow us to be successful are the same ones we point our finger at when we say that's drift. Right? And I'm a little bit worried that means we're kind of missing some stuff. I'm a little bit worried that means that the approaches we're taking to deal with this thing that we call drift may actually hurt us in the same way that we talked about, kind of the approaches to fixing people hurt us, right? Because they were getting rid of the very things that are making us successful. Does this make sense so far? So yes, I love it. So I have one of my employees that works with me. He's not a preacher, but he should be. He teaches like regulatory stuff, like hardcore DOT stuff. Like he really, it's the most boring stuff on earth, but he loves it. He gets so pumped. He literally will do spin moves in his classes. I swear to God, it's a thing. And I'm like, oh, that is so exciting. Okay. So some takeaways here, some key takeaways, and then I want to present maybe a different way to look at drift and maybe some practical takeaways, time permitting, and hopefully, again, please ask questions and everything, because I think what we're seeing is that drift is a natural reaction to complexity, and this has some implications, and the first one is maybe drift isn't always bad. If the only time we see drift is after an accident, that could be because drift only happens in accidents, or it could be because that's the only time we're looking. Right? And I think maybe we need to start looking at other times. I suspect that drift may be responsible for a lot more good things than we actually give it credit for. I'm not saying it's a net positive. I'm just saying it's very possible. And if that's true, that leads to the second thing. Elimination of drift may not be possible or even ideal. Because it may be that a lot of the things that we consider innovations are a product of the same processes that we would point to and say that's drift. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Is that good or bad? It is. It is, right? Exactly, right? Isn't drift just learning shortcuts? Absolutely, because again, the idea, I said it like a little bit earlier, hinted at, and he said, isn't drift just learning shortcuts for the Zoom people? Sorry, I wanted to make sure I repeat that, otherwise I'm gonna get in trouble. Okay. But he's totally right, right? I think it's the same basic thing. Hard work is not its own reward. That is a really nice phrase. It sounds awesome, but it's just not true. Like, I mean, just realistically, if we said, okay, the way to get out of this room is to walk in circles 12 times, okay? You need to high five 5 random people, and then I want everybody to sing Dixie, and then you can exit, because hard work is its own reward. Right? That makes no sense. You'd be like, why the hell are you having me do this, Ron? That's stupid. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. So we want to work as hard as we need to get work done. And sometimes we don't think we need to work as hard as we're being asked to. And that's when we do a shortcut. Yeah. So yes, Brian asked an excellent question, and he may have snuck a peek at some of my later slides. No, I know. So he asked the question for the Zoom people, are we assuming that the black line, work as imagined, is fixed, and maybe is it variable? And my answer to you, which is a big spoiler, is we are assuming it's fixed, and I believe we are wrong. I believe we are actually, in one conceptualization, because we've got to remember this whole idea of black line, blue line, work as imagined, work as done are just made up fictions. They're just models that we use to describe reality, nature. So, it's not like one's right, one's wrong. I'm just saying that in reality, if we actually are talking about imagination and how people think about work, I'm pretty sure there's multiple work as imagines in your organization. So, third implication, drift into failure versus drift into success may be a matter of perspective, right? And that's an interesting one, because if we take Rasmussen at his word and hey, migration towards boundaries is a bad thing. Well, migration towards the boundaries in one direction is migration towards success in another perspective, right? So, because the answer safety and reliability people give is, oh, we need to push away from the boundary. Well, now that's drift towards failure towards another boundary. So that's a problem, right? Yeah.
Can you believe that you are drifting into success, but actually drifting into failure?
So the question is, can you believe if you're drifting into success, but actually be drifting to failure? I would say that's almost true 100% of the time, if maybe not 100%, maybe it is 100%, because again, I think that's the mistake we made with the language of drift, because it sounds like it's this mindless, unintentional thing, but one of the things Scott Snook did really intelligently is he separated practical action from practical drift. Drift is made up of practical actions. Those actions are not mindless. They are 100% intentional, and they are all designed to achieve success. Every single one of them, right? So every time people are engaging in drift, they are doing so because they believe it will help them achieve their goals better, right? Any adjustment someone makes, right? These are not just like nefarious people, right? So I thought I saw another, yeah. Hi, Tanya.
Does the drift literature have successful outcomes and analyzing the pathway as many different?
Excellent question. So she asked, does the drift literature have any successful outcomes and sort of analyzing, kind of using drift to analyze a success? Is that, if I'm understanding you right? Yeah. No, none that I'm aware of, right? And that's not surprising, because that's kind of not our MO. Most of the time it's kind of funner to study the kablooies.
I guess the question to that though, especially over a long period of time, more likely everything before that failure was success.
Yes.
Right. So in a way, yes, those were all successes until this time. Exactly.
Now the problem, of course, is that the lens the researcher or the investigator, whoever it is taking to it after the event is often to understand how the failure happened, not to understand how the success happened. And kind of another spoiler for maybe one of the things I think we should be focusing on, how to optimize and support that success to be more sustainable and more resilient. So yeah, excellent questions. So to get to Brian's question, which was very smart, okay, I want to make a really important point here using the black line, blue line model. And the idea is that drift is different than variability. I don't think these are necessarily the same. I think variability can include drift, right? But not all variability is drift. So typically we'll see a black line. Oh my goodness, that went really fast. We'll see a black line and a blue line like this, right? I don't believe that's drift. I believe that's just normal performance variability, because every time someone does work, they're not, let's be honest, it is extraordinarily rare that someone follows a procedure, rule, or even a norm prescriptively, blindly, without thought. It is very rare. Maybe we do that when we build IKEA furniture. That's probably it. Okay. Outside of that, we zig and we zag based on what makes sense to us, right? Now, that isn't to say that the procedure, though, is useless, and then I'll get to your question. I'll get to that one second. It's not to say the procedure is useless. It's just to say that the procedure isn't the only thing guiding action. But notice that the procedure is guiding action, right? So sometimes people will frame like, oh, we just need work is done, not work is imagined. But that's actually not necessarily true, right? Because we don't want to remake how we do work every single day. Work is imagined sort of creates the gravity around which work migrates. It's a way to think about it. Yeah. Solely drifting? Like Sully Sullenberger? Yeah, I think that's an excellent example, right? So now it's hard, one of the, Sully definitely had to drift or deviate, right? Maybe we'll say from some standard or expectation. Now, using my definition, it's hard to say because maybe, would he do it every time? We're not going to like test this. Okay, how many times when you lose all engines will you do this? But I think you're right. That's an example. It's the same processes that we point to when we say drift. I think you're right. Well, yes, he did literally drift. Yes, he did. This is accurate. I can't lie. I can't argue with that. So the other way to look at it, so we have our work as imagined. And sometimes we'll see a blue line that's like this, right? Where we see a clear and persistent migration away from the black line. Right? In this particular case, I think this is drift. And importantly, I think when we observe this, we will often see, again, not random variation, but we will actually, if we can start to infer that there is a new black line that has emerged, a new way that work is done. That first black line could be what we call, or what Steve Sharrock calls, work as prescribed, right? Which is not necessarily the same as work as imagined. There are many, many times that people will have at different parts of the organization an imagination or a perception of how this work is done. I remember I was doing an investigation after an accident involving some rail car loaders who were loading acid. And we were talking about, I was talking about it with the plant manager, and we were saying, okay, what's the procedure for this? And he would outline the procedure for me. And and then I'd say, okay, where is the procedure? And he would have no idea. And when we finally found it, even what he told me wasn't the same that was in the procedure. Okay. I mean, that's just stuff that happens. I'm not going to throw him under the bus or anything. I'm just going to say that's something that happens. And I think there's many times that we would start to see that, hey, work as imagined is actually shifting over time. I think that is the essence of drift, if drift is a thing. If drift is a thing, it is a shift in work as imagined within a cohesive work group. Yeah.
You can always also say, depending on who you ask in the organization, that work is imagined is going to be, they're going to have a different perspective, different perception of how work gets done.
Yeah. So his question is, if you ask different people in the organization, wouldn't you find basically different work as imagines and different work crews? And absolutely, an implication of this, the very next slide, is that it may be possible that we can use social networks within your organization to find clusters of drifts, right? Because you will find different work as imagines throughout the organization, most likely. Back to like what Dave was saying in his previous presentation about how different work groups, different subcultures are developing different expectations and belief systems about how the organization functions. If that's true, then I think we will see this. Right? That's something that is happening. So, Tony, I saw your hand up. Mm. Mm. So question, I think I went out for a second. I think just so for the Zoom people, so he talked about an organization or industry really where, and I've seen this in, a few different industries where you'll have like a SOP and then you'll have like a batch record, or it could be other things in other industries. And over time, the workers aren't going to use both because they just assume it's so regulated, so tightly controlled. I can just rely on the batch record and that's fine. Would that be, I would say yes. The batch record sort of becomes their work as imagined, right? It becomes a proxy for them. And that, whether that's true or not is a separate question. The prescription is the SOP, exactly, right? So that would be the original, black line, yeah. Yeah, so, oh yeah.
Just another comment. I work with a group of 4 shift clerks in a DuPont schedule, and we've actually started prescribing their desk instructions to say these steps have to be done in this order, in this way, and these things can be done however you feel most comfortable for your authorization, and give them the room to play with that.
Yeah. I like that. And that reminds me of something Jim said. So for the Zoom people, you were saying that like you have work crews and you have, okay, parts of the work, very prescribed. You got to do it this way. But then there's other parts where there's some, room for maneuver there. You can kind of, here's the sandbox you can play in, but build whatever you want in that sandbox, right? Within the boundaries, right? So it's very similar to kind of creating the bounds if I'm understanding it right. So and I think that's, yeah. That makes a lot of sense. So, but again, you're starting to see that one, I don't think drift just exists in people's behavior. I think if drift is something that, just existed in my head, then we could just get rid of me and that would be fine. But every time we see drift, we point at it, it's groups, right? So if that's true, then it's a social thing. And I think we should be understanding the social processes that exist. If that's true, also, we may be able to start to see predictable patterns, right? So looking at social ties in the organization may help you be able to see where you do and don't have drift, right? So, or parts of your organization that are very close have strong ties. You can start to predict that, okay, if this work crew is very close to that work crew, something that's happening here is probably going to be replicated there in some way, shape, or form. Because again, if we think of this as like they're finding a best practice, you can kind of put it in those terms, even though best practice is its own discussion. They would be like, hey, we found this new way to do this task. It worked really well, saved me a bunch of time, wanted to let you know. Okay. Whereas if this crew and that crew don't get along or just don't ever talk because they're on shift work or separated by geographic boundaries or language, then there may be sharing, but that sharing is not strong and therefore unlikely to spread. Right. So you can start to see patterns and probably how these things are going to move throughout the organization.
I see individuals drift within the same work. The reason I say that is, one of the indicators I have to go in for power plants, so a lot of time I'm a visitor. So I'm going in and I don't just go in for one day, I might go in for 2 weeks to do whatever I need to do. And it seems like every day I go in, the process of getting through that back of the gate is a little different depending on who's there, even though they're all in the same work.
Yeah. So I hear what you're saying. So he was saying that he sees individual variability. And the example is you go into like security places and you go day to day and you get different security people who are walking you through and the procedures may be slightly different, right? From day to day, or sometimes dramatically different in some cases, right? I would actually argue most of the time that's just variability. Because when we talk about normal performance variability, it doesn't just exist within individuals, it exists between individuals. And the thing to look for is, does the variability kind of migrate around the expected behavior, right? The expected prescription, if you will, or is it dramatically different from the expected behavior, so that we can, again, going to that previous slide, that we have a whole new gravity that is kind of pulling this. Yeah.
One of the Zoom attendees chatted in that
awesome.
This is like the effect of influencers. They can drive drift. If you move them, they may transfer the drift.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a big implication here. And this is why I think this, the social network piece of it is probably one of the parts that's going to be the least interesting to most of us because it's not as familiar. I think that's a really important insight here because there's a ton of research on social network effects, including social network structures that do and do not inhibit migration of change throughout an organization, the migration of routines throughout an organization. There's a lot of research in this area that we can tap into and maybe find some good insights that can help us. And so understanding, okay, what sorts of, because really what's an influencer is someone who has multiple connections. What sorts of connections should I look for, right? And one of the kind of interesting insights to show what I'm talking about in the social network research is the people that we traditionally point to as influencers are actually often laggards, right? Their reputation is so important to them that they're not willing to take a risk on something new until they have a large group of people that are willing to support them. So you actually want to look at the fringes of the organization to find the change earlier rather than the center. Yeah.
Then say some variation happens in route, and all of a sudden it's like, hey, take the next exit, and then it worms you around like all the way through Brooklyn to get to the west side. And you're like, why are you doing this? But it gave you a new black line and that you needed to follow. But then let's say you get in an accident on the way, and they're like, well, you deviated from your path. Like, yeah, but I was on a new black line that that's just the nature of the variation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and part of the black line, so his question for the Zoom people is about Waze. You start to see this with other of the navigation apps, but I think Waze is one of the first to do this like that. We're really, traffic's coming up that was unexpected. So they're going to deviate you from your path. And now you're on this whole new path, sightseeing through Brooklyn all of a sudden, and you're like, okay, where are you taking me? If I start seeing desert, I'm going to get scared. Anyways, so is that a new black line? And I say yes. And part of the black line as well is follow the app, right? That's part of your mental model about how that work is done. Is I follow the app, right? Whereas maybe there is a prescription that you follow the app unless, or you use the app to guide you, but you also use these things, right? I mean, that's probably a bad example because most of us are just going to blindly follow the app. That's 100% what I'm doing to get back to the airport, right? But like, it's not always that way. Yeah.
Just a slightly different example. Like, hey, it's saying to go this way, but I know that that's a lot of stop signs, a lot of stoplights that doesn't take into account. I think this is actually better, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that would be me drifting from what the guidance would be. And I'm doing it because my experience tells me this is still really a better way.
Yeah, so you have a different work as imagined that's there based on your model about how to get to that location, right? So okay, it's telling me to go this way, but that's a horrible way to go. This time of day, are you kidding me? Getting to the valley? If you're from LA, right? So absolutely. And I think, and this leads to, I know I got a couple minutes left, so I'm just going to jump to these practical takeaways and I'll say one thing. This is one of the reasons why I'm not sure drift is actually a useful way to describe even what we're talking about, because what he just described is actually adjustments, right? I adjusted my performance based upon what I knew and what information I had given to me. Right. And I think when we frame it in that way and understand that people are not drifting, they are acting in a way that makes sense to them in the moment. They are intentional actors. They are real people, right? Then we will start to see, okay, maybe we need to treat this differently. And if that's the case, number one, I think drift is not a problem we need to eliminate. It's an indicator to be monitored. There's one interesting paper where the person said drift is actually an indication not of what the individuals are doing, but what the organization is doing relative to its environment. Right, so the blue line, we were talking about this over lunch, the blue line shows the zigging and the zagging, which is good and interesting, but what it's hiding is what is the zigging and zagging for. It's not random, it's happening for a reason. So maybe we can monitor where drift is occurring, and that can be an indicator that, hey, the conditions in this environment are different than the ones that we expected, or even in the ones in other parts of the organization. There's something different that's there that we should be understanding and monitoring. Secondly, if we increase the ability to learn about everyday work, that can illuminate and form drift, right? And I think, this probably is a horse that's been beaten to death over this conference, but I'm going to hit it one more time. It's critical, right? Because the third piece, managing the flow of information, I believe, is one of our core functions, especially if we're thinking about managing this thing we want to call drift. Most of the cases that I can think of where drift has led to a failure have one of the contributing factors is information that was held in one part of the organization that was really important to helping making good decisions didn't make it to where it needed to go. The information was siloed, it was presented in a way where it was hard to make sense of it, something like that. And so if we are worried about drift, it's that not that drift is occurring, it's where is it occurring and what does that mean about the flow of information? What do those people know that we don't know? And what do we know that they don't know? And what about our information movement and learning systems is inhibiting that? Why don't we already know? You know what I mean? That's the kind of stuff I think we should be thinking about. So with that, I think I have like 25 seconds. So, but any final questions, thoughts, comments, Snyder marks? Yes.
So on the slide that has the blue line and then showing that's variation.
Yeah. This one?
And then this organizational drift. So when you talk about illuminating drift and trying to study it, trying to keep track of it, right? This, I think, shows a problem statistically with that, because if you have all these little oscillations, and it's going in a certain direction, right? The amount of time for it to actually make a pattern can really vary.
Yeah.
So if you are just looking every single day to see if this is happening, you may never see it, but then when you look back 10 years, you might say, oh, now I see a pattern because I have enough data, I have enough statistical data points. So how often should you in your organization kind of be trying to see these trends?
That's a really good question. So the question is, how often should you be looking for this stuff? But this is why, number one, the word monitor is important, not measure. We're not necessarily going to measure it. We're going to monitor it over time. So we're going to look at, the work that's happening today, and then just see where it's trending towards, where it's moving away from, moving towards, et cetera, right? Put that work in context, give it historical context. And then, if you know something about the future, you can quit your job and move to Vegas. But otherwise you could maybe put in context there. But in terms of the amount of time, I would imagine that, and I'm totally thinking out loud right now, I don't have a firm prescription on that. I would say that probably would depend a lot on the level of pressure and complexity, because one of the other things that drives this variation that then ultimately becomes adjustments that turn into drift is pressure, it's scarcity, it's basically the elements of complexity that we point to. So the more complex, including the more work pressure you face, it moved away, the more often you should be looking.
Okay, that's where it can become hindsight, right?
Absolutely.
Look back, like, oh, now I see all this stuff.
Exactly. It absolutely will become hindsight, which is why we should monitor it as adjustments that are happening in real time and put those adjustments in context and ask, what can that teach us about our system? Not what can that teach me about this worker or even this work crew? All right. I think that's all the time I have. I'm happy to talk more during the break if you want to, but otherwise I will shut up and Charles is going to talk.
Thank you, Ron Gant.